Have you ever wondered why the loudest things said about you are often the ones that disappear the fastest? Not right away. Not while everything is still loud, but later when no one brings it up anymore. There's a stretch of time where you almost stand still. No explaining. No reacting. Just continuing to live your life. From the outside, it might look like you're ignoring it, or that you don't have anything to say. But inside, it feels very different. It's like a late afternoon when you turn off the lights in a familiar room, crack the window open just a little, and let the outside air slowly come in. Nothing dramatic happens. No clear turning point. It's just that you no longer feel the need to hold on to the old noise. I once saw this in someone I knew. Not Taurus as a zodiac sign, but Taurus in the way they moved through life steady, grounded, and rarely explaining themselves. There was a time when a lot was being said around them. Nothing loud, but enough to feel. Half-finished sentences. Glances that lingered a little longer than usual. They knew, not in the sense of hearing it secondhand, but in that quiet, unmistakable feeling when you walk into a space and you just know something was said before you arrived. And still they didn't ask. They didn't explain. They didn't try to correct anything. They showed up to work on time. Sat at the same cafe on the weekends. Greeted people the same way they always did. Back then, I wondered if they were pretending not to care. But after a while, I started to see it differently. It wasn't indifference. It wasn't avoidance. It was more like standing in front of murky water, and instead of stirring it to see what's underneath, you choose to stay still and let the water settle on its own. Not because you're sure what will be revealed, but because stirring it more doesn't really help. There are days when that kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful at all. It's not the soft, cinematic quiet people imagine. It's more like cooking something on the lowest heat possible, waiting, without lifting the lid every few seconds to check. You sense that you're doing something right, but you don't have proof yet. And maybe that's when doubt shows up the most. Should I say something? Should I explain? Or at least clear one thing up? Small questions repeating themselves, like the ticking of a clock in a quiet room. And then, at some point very gently, you notice they don't pull you in the same way anymore. Not because you've found the perfect answer, but because you begin to understand not every story needs your involvement to exist. Some stories are built from someone else's perspective. Their experience. What they chose to believe or needed to believe at the time. And sometimes, stepping in to correct it only stretches that story out further. Like when someone is telling a story they already believe, is true, interrupting them doesn't always make them stop. It might just make them keep going in a slightly different way. That person I mentioned, they didn't step in. They stayed outside of it. Not to prove anything, but almost as if they were protecting a small, quiet space of their own, a place where those words couldn't reach. And strangely enough, over time, those stories began to fade. There was no big moment. No one stood up and said, "That was wrong." It was just people stopped bringing it up. Like a song that used to play really loud, then slowly gets turned down until you don't hear it anymore. You don't know exactly when it stopped. Just one day you realize it's no longer there. And when you look back, it doesn't feel like a victory. There's nothing to celebrate. Nothing to prove that you were right. Just a little more space. Like clearing out a small corner of your home, letting go of things you no longer use, and suddenly the room feels easier to breathe in. Maybe for Taurus, or for anyone who's been through something like this, what stays with you isn't what was said. It's how you remained while everything was happening. Not stepping in. Not pushing anything away. Just being there, in your own rhythm. And maybe some questions don't need immediate answers. They just need enough time to grow lighter on their own. And then, in that quiet space, something begins to take shape in a way that's hard to name. It's not a clear moment of being proven right. Not a scene where someone stands up and says everything before was wrong. It's just the way people start to see you slowly shifts. Very slowly. So subtle, almost no one notices it right away. Like the way late afternoon light moves across a wall, no one sees it happening, but when you look back, after a while, everything is in a different place. Silence, sometimes, is misunderstood not because it's weak, but because it's unfamiliar. People are used to clarity being spoken, used to immediate responses, used to protecting their image with words. So when you don't do that, it leaves a space, and that space feels uncomfortable. So they fill it with assumptions. But assumptions, no matter how many times they're repeated, are still just thin layers. Like painting over a wall that was never cleaned. At first, it looks fine, smooth even. But give it a little time and the cracks underneath begin to show through. And the strange part is, you don't have to be the one who peels that paint away. You just have to not add another layer. There are days when that choice still feels uncomfortable. Not because of what others are saying, but because you know you could say something and you choose not to. It feels like holding a message you've already typed out, your finger resting on send dot and then stopping. Not because you lack courage, but because a part of you knows sending it may not truly change anything. So you delete it. Not once, sometimes many times, and each time you learn something small about yourself. That reacting isn't always the only way to hold on to your worth. That some things, when left alone, speak more clearly. The ground you chose not to disturb may have looked empty at first. Nothing growing. No clear sign that you were doing the right thing. But over time, small things begin to appear. Not loudly. Not all at once. Just quiet shifts. Someone who used to stay distant now looks at you a little longer. A conversation feels less strained. A glance that once held doubt softens. You can't point to the exact moment it changed, but you feel it. Like tending to a plant, you don't see it grow each day, but one morning, you notice it's taller than you thought. And in those moments, silence is no longer something you have to endure. It becomes a space. A place where you can stand still without shrinking, without explaining. And what's interesting is when you stop trying to control how others see you, you begin to see things more clearly. Not about them, but about what truly belongs to you and what never did. There are stories told about you that don't actually carry your shape. They're reflections from the person telling them, and when you don't step in to adjust them, those reflections begin to move freely. Free to shift, free to fade, or free to reveal their own instability. You don't have to push them away. You just don't hold on to them. And maybe that's a different kind of strength. Not the kind that silences others instantly, but the kind that allows everything to return to its own quiet. And in that quiet, you start to notice something simple. Not everything needs to be fixed. Not everything needs an answer. Some things, when left alone long enough, begin to say what no one could hear before, not through a louder sound. Not through a sharper explanation, but through something else, the way everything around it begins to quiet down. When you don't step in, the story loses its place to hold on. It's like a kite that's no longer tied to a string. At first, it's still in the air, still moving. But the higher it goes, the more it drifts. And it doesn't fall right away. It just no longer holds its original shape. There's a kind of shift that happens very quietly in moments like this. No one steps in to make a conclusion. No big conversation to clear everything up. It's just that people begin to bring it up less, care less, and sometimes they move on to something else entirely, as if nothing significant was ever there. You stand there and realize you don't have to chase what is already leaving. And the feeling doesn't feel like winning or losing. It feels more like standing still in the middle of a busy street and realizing you don't need to walk as fast as everyone else. You're not trying to prove that you're on the right path. You just know where you are. There's something not many people notice. When you don't step into a story, you're not shaped by it either. You don't have to become the misunderstood version of yourself just to correct it later. You remain who you were from the beginning. And that, in a quiet way, starts to become clearer over time. Not to everyone, But to those who are really paying attention, like watching a stream long enough, you begin to see its true direction. Not in the ripples on the surface, but in the current underneath. There are still days when you might wonder if saying, "nothing lets things go further than they should," if silence might be mistaken for agreement. Those questions don't fully disappear. They just become less loud. And you begin to notice something. Not every misunderstanding needs to be corrected the moment it appears. Some things, if touched too early, spread even more. Like ink that hasn't dried, the more you try to wipe it, the more it smears. But if you let it settle, it becomes clearer on its own terms. In its own place. You're not ignoring the story. You're simply not feeding it. And over time, what isn't fed begins to weaken. Maybe it doesn't disappear completely, but it no longer has enough weight to shape how others see you. There's a certain kind of calm that begins to settle in here. Not the kind that comes because everything is resolved, but the kind that comes when you realize you don't need to resolve it anymore. Your energy starts to move elsewhere, into smaller things, quieter moments, pieces of your day that have nothing to do with the past, a morning coffee without replaying what was said, a conversation that no longer carries the pressure to hold an image together. Things that seem ordinary become the clearest signs that you've stepped out of that loop. And then, at some point, you look back. Not to check who was right or wrong, just to notice that story is no longer at the center. It feels more like a road you once walked. You don't need to go back to see how it changed. It's enough to know you've passed through it, and you didn't carry it with you. And maybe that's what makes everything feel lighter in a very real way. Not because the story disappeared, but because you're no longer inside it. And when you're no longer inside it, the way it exists begins to change. And maybe that's the moment you begin to see everything from a different distance. Not a distance meant to avoid it, but a distance that keeps you from being pulled into every small detail. Like stepping back from a painting, the lines that once bothered you don't feel as sharp anymore. They're still there, but they no longer take up your entire view. There's a moment, very subtle, no noise, no clear sign. Things just begin to slow down, not because someone decided to stop, but like water after a heavy rain, it naturally flows more gently once it's past the steep part. The words that used to be repeated again and again don't show up as often anymore, not because they've disappeared completely, just that they no longer carry enough weight to be repeated the same way. People who once believed without question start to create a little space. Nothing obvious enough to name, but enough for you to feel something has shifted. A glance that's less certain. A question instead of a conclusion. No one says it out loud. Maybe because no one ever held the full story to begin with. But the overall feeling has changed. Like walking into a room that used to be filled with voices, and one day, everything feels softer. Not completely silent, but quiet enough for you to notice the spaces in between. And sometimes those spaces say more than anything that was ever spoken. It's like sitting on a chair that's slightly uneven. At first you can still sit. You adjust your posture. You try to keep your balance. Everything seems fine if you don't pay too much attention. But over time your body starts to notice the imbalance. A slight discomfort. A subtle uncertainty. And then, at some point, you just don't feel like sitting there anymore. Not because someone told you to stand, but because you can feel it no longer fits. You don't need to fix the chair. You don't need to prove that it's uneven. You simply stop sitting on it. And when no one sits there anymore, its instability becomes clearer. Not because you did anything more, but because it's no longer being held in place. There's something a little strange about moments like this. You don't feel lighter right away. There's no instant sense of everything is okay now. Just a little less tension. Like taking off a heavy backpack after a long day. You don't jump with relief. You just stand still and let your shoulders rest. If there is change, it doesn't come from one big moment. It comes from very small things. A morning where you don't think about what happened the moment you wake up. An evening when you realize you didn't replay the story in your mind. Small details like that no one else sees. But for you, they feel real. Like quiet signs that something is moving. Not outside, but inside the way you receive things. And when that changes, everything around you begins to feel different. Not because the world suddenly shifts, but because you're no longer reflecting it the same way. And maybe that's when something simple starts to make sense. Not everything needs to be fixed in order to become clear. Some things, when you stop holding on to them, begin to reveal their true shape. Like a thin layer of dust on glass. If you touch it too much, it spreads. But if you leave it alone, light passing through begins to show you what's clear and what isn't. And maybe, in that process, what changes isn't just the story. It's the way you stand beside it. No longer needing to step in. No longer needing to hold it together. Just standing there with a kind of calm you didn't have before. A calm that doesn't come from everything being resolved, but from realizing you don't need to resolve it anymore. And when that thought truly settles in, everything around you seems to soften. Not because the situation suddenly changes, but because you're no longer carrying that quiet pressure to do something to fix it. There's a kind of answer, a strange one, something you only recognize after you've been through enough time. Not through words, not through explanation, but through the way you continue living. No statements are made. No final conversation to close the story. It's just that you keep showing up each day in a way that feels completely ordinary. You wake up. You do what needs to be done. You keep your rhythm the way you always have. And most of all, you don't reshape yourself to match what others once said about you. You don't try to look more right. You don't try to explain things indirectly. You just live the way you've always lived. At first, it might not seem like anything is changing. Everything still feels familiar. The same looks. The same quiet pauses in conversation. But over time something begins to shift. Not fast. Not loud. Just people start to look again. Not because you asked them to. Not because you proved anything. But because what they're seeing now no longer fits the old story. One small detail doesn't match. Then another. Like rereading a story you once believed, but this time, you're paying a little closer attention. And you begin to notice certain parts don't quite connect. No one says it out loud. But a quiet doubt begins to form. And what's interesting is you don't need to be there to witness any of it. You don't need to know who reconsidered, who changed their perspective. Because at this point, the focus has shifted. It's no longer about what others think of you. It's about how you stand in your own life. There are days when you realize you haven't replayed the old story in your mind at all. No going back over conversations. No imagining what you should have said. Those thoughts don't disappear completely, but they no longer fill the whole space. Like after a heavy rain, a few drops still linger, but the sky has already started to clear. And in that light, you begin to see something simple. Some things don't need to be protected because they're already clear enough. Not clear to everyone, but clear enough to those who are really paying attention. And maybe that's enough. The feeling here doesn't feel like victory. There's no sense of triumph. No finally being recognized. Just a quiet lightness. Like wearing a coat all day, then realizing at night you can finally take it off. Not because the weather changed suddenly, but because you no longer need that kind of warmth. There's a comfort, a quiet one that doesn't need to be seen by anyone else. You don't feel the need to go back and clear everything up. No need to say, that wasn't me. Because in a very natural way, what was never you has already begun to fall away. Like dust on a bright surface. You don't have to scrub it off. Just let the light stay long enough, and it begins to reveal what belongs to the surface, and what was only a temporary layer. And then, in a very ordinary moment, maybe while you're walking, or sitting quietly with a cup of coffee going cold, you notice something. You're no longer inside that story. Not because it disappeared completely, but because you stepped out of it without needing to carry anything with you. And maybe that's the clearest answer there is, not what you said, but the way you're still here, lighter, quieter, and no longer needing to prove anything at all. There's a feeling that shows up after all of that one that's hard to name. Not the kind of lightness that comes from dropping everything all at once, and not a clear kind of happiness you could easily describe. It's more like stepping outside. After a long stretch of rain, the ground is still wet. The air still carries that scent of water, but the sky has opened just enough for you to take a deeper breath. When things settle, you don't feel the need to go back and fix anything. Not because you've forgotten, but because you no longer feel the need to hold on to it. Some things, if you carry them for too long, start to become a part of you even when you never meant for that to happen. And then, at some point, you let go. Not through some big decision. Just you stop picking it back up. No need to explain again. No need to revisit who was right or wrong. Those stories gradually move behind you. They don't disappear completely, but they're no longer in front of your eyes. You just continue, in a very ordinary way. One morning, you open the door, light falls across the floor, and you notice you're paying attention to smaller things. The sound of a car passing by, the smell of fresh coffee, the feeling of sitting down without carrying the old thoughts with you. Small things, but they tell you you've gone farther than you realized. And sometimes, people come back. Not when you expect it. Not at a planned moment. Just randomly. They speak differently, slower, less certain. Or sometimes, they don't say anything at all. Just silence, but this time, it feels different. It's no longer distance. It feels more like a quiet kind of acknowledgement, one that doesn't need to be named. And you don't feel the need to react much. No need to show that you're okay. No need to prove that you've moved on. You're just not pulled in that direction anymore. Like passing by a road you used to take and realizing you don't feel the need to turn into it again. Not because the road is bad. Just it no longer leads you where you want to go. At this point, what matters is no longer the old story. It's the way you stand. Steady. Not because everything around you is quiet, but because something inside you is no longer unsettled. Clear. Not because you've explained everything, but because you no longer doubt yourself. And you're no longer pulled by what has already passed. There's no urge to go back and finish it properly. No need to make everything make sense. You just let it stay there in its place in the past. Looking back, maybe that silence was never weakness. It was more like a foundation, one no one could see, but strong enough to hold everything above it from falling apart. You stayed there long enough for that foundation to settle. No rush, no need to prove anything, just long enough. And in that time, everything above it began to rearrange itself. Not perfectly, but steady enough to stand. Maybe that's what you didn't see before. That sometimes, strength isn't about changing everything right away. It's about staying in your truth long enough for what isn't true to fall away on its own. And when everything returns to its place, you don't have to do anything else. No standing in the middle to explain. No retelling the story again. You just stand there. Not above anyone. Not more right than anyone. Just true to yourself. And maybe, in that quiet, there's a kind of freedom, a very gentle one that doesn't need anyone else to confirm it, but you can feel it clearly. Like walking forward without carrying what once weighed you down. Not because you forgot, but because you set it down where it belonged. And from there, each step you take feels just a little lighter. No need to rush. No need to move fast. Just be real with yourself.